Terry Peder Rasmussen.
Terry Rasmussen.
Rasmussen.
Terry Rasmussen.
Terry Rasmussen.
Terry Rasmussen.
From 1978 to 2002, a murder spree spanned across the United States, amassing a body count of 6 women and children. Although it is highly possible that there are some victims that still remain unknown. It took police over 3 decades to connect the crimes to one man. However, he was only brought to justice for one of these crimes. This is the Terry Peder Rasmussen story. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, hi. My name is Jessica, and welcome to my channel, where I explore new true crime cases each week. If you have an interest in true crime like me, and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Before we get started today, I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of a heads up. Typically, I try to do these videos in a linear fashion, where I start in early life and I kind of go chronologically throughout the story. Today isn't gonna be like that, so pay attention, because this story is wow. Okay, great. Our story begins in Allenstown, New Hampshire, more specifically in Bear Brooks State Park, which is absolutely massive. It sits on over 10,000 acres worth of property, and it's comprised of 40 miles worth of hiking trails. Like, it's real big. There is a ton of the park that very rarely, if ever, gets traveled by humans. It's just thick, dense forest as far as the eye can see, and if you're not careful, you could very easily get lost out there, or hide out there, which is precisely what one group of kids in particular like to do for fun. Jesse Morgan and his friends absolutely loved to play hide and seek in the woods. All of the children would hide while one of them would ride around on a 4-wheeler and try to find them. So it's summer, 1985. The kids are out playing in the woods, having the time of their life. Woo, summer break. When they stumble across something unusual. Jesse was riding around with one of the other boys when they noticed like an old, rusted 55-gallon like steel drum barrel. It was secluded off the trail and it just seemed out of place. So they really had no choice other than to go and check it out. Boys will be boys. They pried open the barrel and immediately they were hit with like a putrid, rancid smell. Their follow-up was to just kick it right over. They kicked it over, hopped on their 4-wheelers, and left, because kids are destructive. But to be fair, at that age, they could have no idea what they had almost just discovered. And for months, the barrel remained right there, just as the boys had left it. Until November 1985, when a hunter happened across the very same barrel. He also decided to take a closer look. But this time, after exploring it for just a few moments, he realized that the contents of the barrel appeared to be human remains. Once he was able to process what he had just found, he contacted police, and he was pretty quickly joined in the woods by, and I know I'm going to butcher this name, Officer Ron Montplaisir Jr. I'm gonna call him Officer Ron for the rest of the video. Officer Ron makes his way over to see for himself what's really inside this barrel. When he opened the plastic bag that had kind of slumped out of the barrel, the first thing that he saw was a human skull just looking right at him. That was all the information he needed. State police, as well as the Attorney General, were then notified, and a full-blown investigation began. Inside the barrel was not one, but 2 separate bodies. One of an adult female in her early 20s to early 30s, and one of a female child between the ages of 8 and 10. Both victims' cause of death would soon be revealed to be blunt force trauma to the head. Other than that, unfortunately, there was nothing immediately identifiable about these victims. Therefore, police had little to no information to begin their investigation with. Statistically speaking, less than half of murders occur between strangers, so a victim's identity is super important to a murder investigation. If you know who your victim is, you can take that information and build off of it. You can question family, friends, coworkers, people they talked to at a grocery store one time 5 years ago. Chances are, if you're killed by somebody you know, they're gonna be able to piece together that connection, no matter how insignificant it may seem at first. But when you have no victim identity, you don't have that information as a jumping off point. Officer Ron had no choice but to literally go door to door and ask, like, hey, you know anyone that was here one day, poof, gone the next? He visited what he later would estimate to be upwards of 200 houses, but his neighborhood canvas turned up absolutely nothing. And even that was just taking a shot in the dark because they didn't even know if their victims were from the area. They could have just as easily been transported from somewhere and hidden there. It's just not that common for what appears to be a mother and a child to go missing from such a tight-knit area and nobody knows about it. But sadly, that appeared to be what was happening. Because 2 years after the barrels had been discovered, investigators were no closer to finding answers than they had been on the very first day. Ultimately, the remains were released and given a proper and respectful burial. A donated headstone placed on their grave read, "Here lies the mortal remains known only to God of a woman aged 23 to 33 and a girl child aged 8 to 10. Their slain bodies were found on November 10th, 1985 in Bear Brook State Park. May their souls find peace in God's loving care." And after the burial, the case went cold. For 15 years, not an ounce of progress was made, and it wasn't for lack of trying. Investigators exhausted every avenue or potential lead they could find, but they just kept coming up empty-handed. At this point, we're going to put a pin in what's going on in New Hampshire, and we're gonna take a little road trip. Across the country, actually, to Scotts Valley, California, 1986. A man named Gordon Jensen and his 5-ish-year-old daughter Lisa were staying at the Holiday Host RV park. During this stay, Gordon was working as a handyman of sorts, taking odd jobs he could find around the RV park just to make ends meet. As Gordon began getting acquainted with his neighbors, he really hit it off with one couple in particular, a couple named Catherine and Richard Decker. And as one often does in friendship, Gordon began to confide in the Deckers, explaining that he was having a really difficult time caring for Lisa by himself, which didn't really surprise the Deckers. They could tell way before he'd ever said anything that things weren't really going well. Lisa was thin and often dirty, and a lot of times could be heard crying for hours late into the night. Gordon actually cried when he was telling the Deckers all of this information. He told them that more than anything, he just wanted her to have a better life. Now, the Deckers are just eating this shit up. Like, they believe him and they want to help him. They ended up telling Gordon that their daughter might be willing to take Lisa in. So Gordon suggests that they do that the Decker's daughter take Lisa in for 2 weeks for a trial adoption. Not long after they had come to this agreement, the Deckers took Lisa to Southern California to their daughter's house to test the arrangement out. And despite it sounding kind of like, they did what? It was a big success. Lisa fit right into their family and everyone seemed really happy. But as she became more comfortable, Lisa began showing signs that at some point in her past, she had endured some form of abuse. And it quickly became apparent to everyone that she was much safer here with the Decker's daughter than she was with her father, Gordon Jensen. Although she was safe now, authorities were still contacted and Lisa was still interviewed in order to kind of gauge what exactly this little girl had been through. Meanwhile, the Decker's attorney drew up paperwork to finalize and legalize the adoption. All they needed was Gordon's signature. But when they attempted to contact the man they believed to be Lisa's father, he was gone. It just vanished into thin air. Immediately, police began an investigation into this man. Not only was he potentially guilty of abusing this poor girl, but now he'd abandoned her with almost strangers. San Bernardino detectives began by questioning people around the RV park, asking if they knew anything, knew where Gordon had went, and they got nothing. They didn't have any information to use to start their investigation. They were really hoping that through questioning the other residents, they might be able to retrieve some shred of information that might give them a starting point. But unfortunately, like I said, no one knew anything. Like anything at all. So the detective began searching around the RV park for anything that could potentially be evidence. Incredibly, he was able to retrieve 8 pristine fingerprints off of a piece of electrical equipment Gordon had installed while working at the RV park. The fingerprints were ran and they came back as a match to a man named Curtis Kimball. His fingerprints were on file from a drunk driving incident in 1985, for which he'd been paroled and subsequently absconded. It took 2 years to finally track this man down. He was arrested for driving a stolen car in 1988, and when he was taken in for questioning, he gave investigators the name Gerald Mockerman, for which he had a matching date of birth and social security number. But when they fingerprinted him, his prints came back as a match to Curtis Kimball. Police took the opportunity at hand and charged him with child abandonment, for which he actually served 1 year in prison before being released on parole in 1990. The day he was released on parole, he fled again. And because her father had ditched parole and her mother was dead, Lisa was seized from her new home by Child Protective Services. Little did anyone know, shit was about to get even weirder. Jumping back over to New Hampshire, we're in 2000, Y2K, the new millennium, about 15 years after the barrel was initially discovered. The case had gone cold, police theories had fallen apart one by one, and their pool of potential leads had long since dried up. They were no closer to solving the case than they had been 15 years ago when Jesse and his band of hooligans had kicked over the barrel in the first place. A state trooper named John Cody began looking into the Allenstown case and, starting at square one, attempted to work his way through. He re-examined the barrel, and when that didn't really yield anything new, he decided that the best course of action would be to head out to Bear Brook State Park and kind of take a look around the area where the barrel had initially been discovered, because, let's be honest, he really didn't have anything else to go off of. So he goes out, he's surveying the area, getting a lay of the land, looking for anything he can find that police may have missed. Anything that might point him in a direction that has yet to be explored. So he's looking around when he notices an unnatural hump in the terrain. Something you or I or any of the other trained investigators who had been through the area up to this point would find odd or worth looking into, apparently. Nevertheless, he found it odd, so he goes to get a closer look and quickly realizes that that's no hump in the terrain at all. Mr. Cody had actually just found himself a whole-ass other barrel. The barrel appeared identical to the first, right down to the fact that it also contained the skeletal remains of 2 female victims, one of which was between the ages of 1 and 3, and one that was between the ages of 2 and 4. Now, I have some thoughts. Mainly, how in the hell did y'all miss that second barrel the first time? If this one single man saw it on his first trip out into the woods, you're telling me that the waves of cops that had already been through there never so much as looked in that general direction? Not one single person was like, maybe we should fan out, see if there's anything else worth looking into. They claim that it was outside the proximity of the initial, crime scene, but it was 100 yards away. 300 feet. 0.05 miles. It takes, on average, 20 minutes to walk a mile. 5% of 20 is 1. It was a 1-minute walk from the first barrel. How is that outside the proximity of the crime scene? You're telling me that an outdoor crime scene is not at least 1 minute in any general direction? That shit just blows my mind. So this brings the Allenstown victim count to 4, 1 adult female and 3 small female children. It appeared to be an entire family that had been murdered, and there was no missing persons report to match them. The discovery of the second barrel did nothing but further the complexity of the case. They thought they were at a dead end with 1 barrel, and then they had the whole case just double down on them. It was just so unbelievable. How do 4 people go missing, 3 of which are small children, and no one is looking for them? You know what's also unbelievable is them missing that second barrel the first time. Back in California, to reiterate, I know this story is like a hot-ass mess, but there really isn't a way to tell it that isn't all over the place. I'll kind of recap and condense the timeline at the end. Richmond, California. We're still in Y2K. A woman by the name of Eun Soon Jun brings her boyfriend, Larry Vanner, home to meet her family for the first time. This is a nerve-wracking time for everyone involved, and unfortunately for Eun Soon, it did not go well. Her family hated this man. They thought he was creepy and rude. Not to mention, they began to notice that the more time she spent with him, the more withdrawn she became from them. Basically, red flags were just sprouting up all over the place when it came to this man. But Eun Soon didn't see them, and the relationship carried on. Until 2002, when Eun Soon's friends were suddenly unable to reach her by phone. They grew worried, and they also grew pretty suspicious. Even though Larry was always ready and waiting with some weak-ass excuse as to why Eun Soon couldn't come to the phone, her friends really weren't trying to hear it. Fed up with Larry's goddamn stories, Eun Soon's friend Renee Rose told him that if she hadn't heard from Eun Soon by the time she returned home from vacation in 10 days, she was going to call the police and formally report her missing. And when she returned home and saw that she did not have a message waiting from Eun Soon, she did just that. Basically, don't mess with Renee. Roxanne Grunheide, a detective for the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office, received the call. The missing persons investigation kicked off fairly traditionally by questioning the partner, Eun Soon's boyfriend, Larry Vanner. Detective Grunheide described him as polite and soft-spoken, noting that he could very easily seem trustworthy. However, what he wasn't was cooperative. He spent the interview deflecting questions and telling stories to waste time, and he barely ever even mentioned Eunsoon. And when he did mention her, he really couldn't seem to keep his story straight as to where she was or why she was unavailable. Police request that Larry get fingerprinted, and he agrees. He had his fingerprints taken and they were sent to be analyzed, but they did not come back as a match to Larry Vanner. No. His prints instead matched those of a man by the name of Curtis Kimball, Lisa's dad. Police confront him with their findings, and he's like, "What? Curtis Kimball? Never heard of him." Honestly, questioning him was really more of a formality. Police had all of the information that they needed and arrested him right then and there. Because if nothing else, he had violated his parole, so they weren't just going to let him walk right out of there. Once they had Curtis in custody, the detectives then headed over to the home in order to search for Eunsoon. While the house wasn't immaculate by any stretch, there wasn't really anything to indicate that something violent had taken place there. What was odd, though, was that there wasn't really anything to indicate that a woman even lived there. No purses, shoes, clothing, nothing that would lead someone to believe that Eunsoon had been living there. They continued to search the house, but their search yielded nothing, so they moved on to the garage, where at the back they found a crawl space. And in the crawl space, they found a giant pile of kitty litter. Bet you didn't see that one coming. Yeah, neither did they. What was alarming, though, was the amount of blood spatter around the crawl space. They knew something was not right, as if the giant pile of cat litter wasn't enough cause for suspicion. CSI was called to secure the integrity of the scene before the pile could be searched. Once they began digging, the first thing they discovered was a mummified human foot. Forensic testing revealed that the body was that of Eunsoon Jun, and that she had passed away from blunt force trauma to the head. Larry Vanner / Curtis Kimball was charged with murder, to which he pled guilty, no questions asked. But he refused to speak about the matter further. He wanted to plead guilty and go quietly off to prison. Case closed. But this did not sit well with people, specifically Detective Grunheide. She had a gut feeling that there was more to his story and that he was being so passive because this was just the tip of the iceberg. He wanted to plead guilty and disappear into the system, but Detective Grunheide was not going to let that happen. Now, remember, Curtis Kimball had now gone by Larry Vanner, Gerald Mockerman, and Gordon Jensen, father to Lisa. Detective Grunheide decides to circle back around to little Lisa, who at this point was actually in her early 20s, so she wasn't so little anymore. DNA samples from Lisa and Curtis Kimball were compared, and it turned out there was no familial link between the two of them. You are not the father. This prompted Detective Grunheide to reach out to the investigators who had handled Lisa's case and let them know that, hey, she's actually a Jane Doe. At one point, she was likely a missing person, and there's probably family out there hoping and praying for her safe return. After receiving this information in 2003, the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department launched a whole new investigation into Lisa's identity and the exact circumstances surrounding her apparent abduction. Authorities contacted Lisa and filled her in on what they had learned, and understandably, she was just as determined as they were to put the pieces together and figure out her true identity. I cannot. Sitting here today as a full-grown adult, I cannot imagine getting a phone call from police telling me that I am not who I think I am. To find out that your entire identity is a mystery, I can barely handle minor everyday inconveniences, so I have to imagine my head would just explode. Now knowing that she had been rescued from the custody of a convicted murderer, police were pretty worried about what they might find when they started digging into who Lisa's family was and where they were now. But it would take 15 years before they would find answers to any of these questions. So New Hampshire, 2015, still no progress has been made in the Allenstown Barrel case. Investigators decide to team up with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Together, they created new and up-to-date composite sketches of what the victims might have looked like. They were hoping that this might help to reignite interest in the case. And it did. It reminded people that these were real people with real lives that had been unjustly taken from them. Sometimes it's easy to hear or read about these things and kind of dissociate from the reality of them, to almost process the information as if the people involved are fictional in some way. But it's important to remember to take a step back and realize that that's simply not the case. These were real people like you or me, and despite the fact that they were thrown away like garbage, their identities mattered. matter. Luckily, this did spark a renewed interest in the case, which police were hopeful would either bring about new leads or, better yet, a family looking to claim the victims. No one could understand how seemingly an entire family could disappear and no one cared. By this time, new technology had come about, so they were able to compare DNA from each of the barrel victims to confirm if they actually were mother and daughters like they'd always been assumed to be, or if the situation was something different entirely. These tests determined that the adult female was likely the mother to the oldest and the youngest child, but that the middle child was not related to the other victims in any way. Which brings us back to California and back to Lisa, who was growing more and more frustrated that years kept passing and she still was no closer to finding out who she truly was. She took matters into her own hands and suggested that maybe her DNA could be submitted to like a genetic genealogy type website, and that if it was, maybe they could find some sort of familial tie to someone out there. Which honestly, way to go, girl. Way to advocate for yourself. Do not take no for an answer. DNA testing to identify a specific individual, I believe, began in the 80s, but genetic genealogy using DNA to determine a relationship between people wasn't used until the early 2000s. Through Ancestry.com, Lisa's DNA did start getting matches to some distant relatives. I'm talking like 4th, 5th cousin distant, so it definitely wasn't as slam dunk as like a parental match would have been, but it was a start. It wasn't going to be easy, but at least now they had some sort of jumping off point. With this information, they looked into potentially using the same method of DNA matching that's used to link adopted children to their biological families to link Lisa to hers. It was especially difficult though because Lisa had no information to give other than her DNA and her estimated birth year. However, despite the odds and after thousands of hours of genealogy, Lisa was finally connected back to her maternal grandfather, Armand Bowden of New Hampshire. Armand was able to not only fill in the identity of Lisa's mother, Denise Bowden, but also Lisa's own true identity. Lisa finally learned that her birth name had been Dawn Bowden. Furthermore, Armand was able to illustrate his last interaction with Denise and Dawn. Thanksgiving, 1981. Dawn was 5 months old, and she and her mother Denise had come to Armand's for Thanksgiving dinner. But alone, they were not. They were accompanied by Denise's boyfriend at the time, a man named Bob Evans. While at dinner, Bob began explaining to the family how, due to some bad debts they had, they'd actually be leaving the area soon, which, like, odd dinner conversation, but I mean, okay. Sure enough, less than a week later, when Armand attempted to invite Denise to his house for Christmas, he discovered that they were already gone, and sadly, Armand would never see his daughter again. But because they'd informed him ahead of time that they were going to leave, he never filed a missing persons report. He carried on under the assumption that the couple had taken Dawn and headed off for a fresh start. Police start connecting some dots. If Bob Evans was the last person with Lisa in New Hampshire before she turned up with Curtis Kimball in California, is Bob Evans yet another version of Curtis Kimball? They were able to verify with mugshots shown to Armand that Bob Evans, Gordon Jensen, Larry Vanner, and Gerald Mockerman were all Curtis Kimball. It was at this point that he earned himself the name the Chameleon, because frankly, he had too many damn fake names to keep up with. Although she was presumed dead, police still decided to open a missing persons investigation on Denise. Not long after that investigation began, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children noticed that Denise had last been seen about 25 miles from Bear Brook State Park, where the Barrel girls had been discovered, and that she'd gone missing 4 years before the first barrel was found. Was there a chance that these cases could all be related? With that idea, I mean, police are fucking hype. They might actually be on the road to solving this case that's been haunting them for 30 years. They started trying every which way to connect the Chameleon to the Allenstown victims. Was it possible that maybe Denise Bowden was the adult female found in the first barrel? The only way to find out was to exhume the bodies and perform a DNA comparison. So they did just that, and it was really disheartening for everyone when the results came back that there was no way that Denise was the woman in the barrel. But the exhumation was not for nothing. They were also able to compare the victim's DNA to the DNA of Bob Bob, Curtis, Gordon, Larry, Gerald, John, Jacob, Jingleheimer, Schmidt. And these tests determined that the little girl who was not related to the other victims was actually the biological child of this nightmare of a man. What this did was definitively and without a doubt connect him to the Allenstown case. But these answers just continued to spawn more questions. Specifically, who is this little girl's mother, and is she still alive? Likely not, considering the fact that no one who crosses paths with this asshat seems to make it out alive. Not to mention that it appears he's killed his own daughter, which is inconceivable to a normal person, but serial killers have no empathy. They are incapable of forming human connections or truly caring about another human being. So logic would lead one to assume that she probably had not made it out of the relationship alive. At this point, the Chameleon had earned the title of serial killer, with at least 6 victims and likely more that had yet to be discovered. Hoping to find more answers, police reached back out to genetic genealogist Dr. Barbara Ray Venter, who'd helped them initially identify Lisa. They were hopeful that she'd be able to help them again, this time in building a genealogy that could hopefully identify who Curtis Kimball really was, not to mention what dark recesses of hell he may have spawned out of. Dr. Venter is once again able to defy the odds and provide police with an identity. Bob Evans, Gordon Jensen, Larry Vanner, and Gerald Mockerman were not Curtis Kimball at all. Rather, a man named Terry Peder Rasmussen. Police finally had a true identity to track rather than a series of dead-end aliases. With his true identity in hand, they were able to quickly begin piecing his life together. He was born on December 23rd, 1943 in Denver, Colorado, so thanks guys. I'm just kidding. He mostly grew up in Phoenix, so he dropped out of high school his sophomore year before enlisting in the Navy in 1961, where he served until he was discharged in 1967. He went on to get married in 1968 and fathered 4 children with his wife before she left him in 1975 and he moved to New Hampshire. Now, police want to speak to his family, his ex-wife, and his living biological children, which I imagine is a phone call that would just really ruin your day. In June 2017, the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit met up with Rasmussen's daughter, Diane Klepfer. They explained the whole messed up story of everything that her father had done and ultimately let her know that she was the daughter of an unhinged lunatic. Obviously, this was a lot for Diane to process. She was haunted by the fact that had her mother not left this man when she did, their family could have likely faced the same fate as Eunsoon Jun, Denise Bowden, and the 4 Allenstown barrel victims. The frustrating part about all of this was no matter how many answers they seemed to get, no matter how much information they seemed to dig up on this man, they still could not seem to identify the barrel victims. It had been 30 plus years and they still did not have any idea who they were. Because Terry's selfish ass died in prison in 2010 before any of these connections had even been formed. Police were stumped. But then, Becky Heath. Becky was a librarian by day and an internet sleuth by night. She took it upon herself to spend hours every night after work scouring the internet. She took that time to read message boards of people speaking about their missing loved ones. She was looking for anyone who could possibly be looking for the Allenstown victims. And one night, she read a post that instantly gave her chills. I mean, I wasn't there, so I don't know that for sure, but it would me, so one would assume. She came across a post that she believed was it. A family that could be searching for the Barrow Girls. The post was a family in search of a woman and her 2 children whose ages, last known location, and last confirmed dates alive could 100% correspond with the Allenstown victims. She reached out to the person who made the post, they began talking, and then the woman on the other end of the conversation dropped a bomb on Becky. Last time I saw her, she was with a man. I think his last name was, any guesses? Rasmussen. With this information, as well as a new form of DNA testing, 3 of the 4 Bear Brook State Park girls were positively identified as Marlise Honeychurch and her daughters Marie Vaughn and Sarah McWaters. Marlise was born on January 28th, 1954 in Stamford, Connecticut, and is described by her family as bubbly and fun with a great sense of humor. She gave birth to Marie in 1971 and Sarah in 1977, and she loved those girls and she loved being a mother more than anything. She and her husband divorced when she was in her early 20s, and unfortunately, this is when she met Terry Rasmussen. Marlise was last definitively seen alive on Thanksgiving 1978. She brought Terry to Thanksgiving at her mother's house, and as most parents meeting this man seems to go, it did not go well. Marlise and her mother got into a very heated argument, likely about Terry being gross, which ended with Marlise gathering up her children and storming out of the house with Terry. And her family never heard from her again. They were always hopeful that she'd come home one day, but obviously, that never happened. And her family really struggled in her absence, especially her mother, who held a lot of guilt for provoking the argument that caused her to leave in the first place. And what's really sad is that her mother actually passed away before her family found out what happened. No one knows exactly what transpired between Terry and Marlise that ultimately caused him to murder her and her children, but there are plenty of theories swirling around, which I'll let you look into on your own time if you so choose, because none of them will ever be proven, and I already know this video is too damn long. What I will say is that it is incredible that through the collaboration of not only law enforcement and scientists from around the country, but civilians as well, 3 of the victims were able to get their identities back and were properly laid to rest in November of 2019. I wish I could say that that concluded this case, but sadly the 4th girl, Rasmussen's own biological daughter, remains unidentified to this day. But hopefully someday authorities can defy the odds again and give this little girl her identity back. As for the condensed timeline of events, it breaks down like this. God, this guy friggin' sucked. I'm glad he died in prison, but I wish he would have waited just a little bit longer. Then he could have identified his daughter, where her mother is, where Denise is, or if there was anyone else. As always, I thank you for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you made it to this point, then I really appreciate you, because this one was long and confusing as hell, so if you're here, thanks for riding it out with me. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. I put out new true crime content each week, and I would love to see you back here in my next video. Until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.